us this morning all the way from Seattle, Washington, Mr. Benjie de la Peña.
Greetings from Seattle. Thank you so much, Nikki. Siguro, if I was going to encapsulate, boil down, ano ba ako, I would say I'm a transportation geek or a transportation nerd, and I love cities. So I'm so glad to be invited again. When Nikki sent me an email, pwede ba? I said, happy to do it. 2019 na pala yun. Last year lang pala yun when I came over and we talked about transportation. So I'm happy to come again to talk about transportation. And Nikki made me promise that I would use very little jargon. I like how she put it. It's conversation. So imagine na ako lang, saka si Jaila yung interpreter, with you talking. Never mind the 40 others. Tayo mag-uusap. The other thing that I decided to do was, pagod na kasiguro kayo sa PowerPoint, no? Everyone does PowerPoint. So, nag-drawing na lang ako and I'll show pictures and then we'll talk. Sabi nga ni Nikki, why do we have the transportation system we have and what can we do to improve it? Yun yung tanong. No, madami tayong pwedeng gawin pero I want to get to the root of the matter. But before we start, along the way, I will give you little poll questions. So yung first poll question ni Nikki was an exercise, right? Practice tayo. So let's start with a real poll question. LA, can you bring up poll question number 1? I will read it. You get to choose one. We'll give you 30 seconds to answer, and then we'll show the results. So, ito yung question. Do you think walking in Metro Manila is safe and easy? Safe but not easy? Easy but not safe? Risky or incredibly risky? Choose one. Okay. Any more pahabol? Let's see the results. LA, can you show it? Yan. Okay. Winning is risky. Okay. 15 of you said it. Easy but not safe. 13 said. One person said safe and easy. And another said safe but not easy. And then 6 of you said it's incredibly risky. Very interesting, right? And I won't explain. These are just questions about how you feel and how you think about the city. Hindi siya graded. Right? So the question we have is the transportation system. If you have a transportation system where it's not safe or at least it's risky to walk, is it an inclusive system? Right? Does it allow everyone to participate in the transportation system? And you have to go and ask, ano ba yung inclusion? What does it mean to be included? My favorite definition, or at least not a definition, but the way to get to inclusion is this saying by Shack and Slum Dwellers International. They are an organization of informal settlers that started forming in India, and now they're in 33 countries in the world. And what they do is basically represent people who live in informal settlements. And they work to make our cities more inclusive. Ang sabi nila, the first step to inclusion is to be counted. If you are not counted, then you are not added to anything. You are not part of any of the considerations. So what they do in informal settlements is take a census so that they know who lives there and how long have people lived there. And from there, then you can engage government, you can engage the powers that be and say, okay, what can we do to solve problems, right? So the question we have for any system is, what do we count? What is it that we say, this is important, so we count it, right? And why does it matter what we count, right? So you are, as if you are a student, what you count is, what are my grades, right? Or if you're a teacher and you're grading for the semester, then you say, how many tests did I give? Ano ba yung grade nila for this? And then you get your grade for the semester. So you're all counted by your grades, which supposedly represent your performance in school. Don't mistake it for representing your intelligence, because you could be very intelligent and get very bad grades, or you could get very, very good grades and you're average, right? But as far as the school is concerned, or as your teachers are concerned, what they measure is your performance in tests, in projects, and all of that. Why does this matter? What do we count in our system? Right? So I'm glad that Nikki asked you guys to put in ano ba yung mode of transportation nyo? And a lot of you wrote down cars. That's what we do in Metro Manila. And it's not unique to Metro Manila. A lot of cities that grew up in the 20th century, this is what they primarily do. We count cars. So, and I'll tell you in a moment why this matters, but a little bit of a digression. Sabi ni Peter Drucker, or at least sabi nila Peter Drucker said it. He may not have said it. He's a management guru from the 90s. Sabi niya, what gets measured gets managed, right? If you're measuring something, then it's easier to manage it. Which is why, if you are a teacher or a student, the grades matter and mid-semester grades matter, because then you can go talk to the student and say, alam mo, babagsak ka na eh. Kailangan mo improve yung next 3 tests mo. Or, you're doing okay, do better. Right? So what gets measured gets managed. And what gets measured matters. What gets measured is change, right? Because this is system feedback. Kung feedback, if you were singing a karaoke and you hear that loud tone, right? That means masyadong malakas yung volume ng mic mo. So you have to lower it. So it's system feedback is what you measure is system feedback. It tells you what is happening to the system or what you think needs to happen in the system. You can only act on what you know. In the Philippines, in Metro Manila, our system likes to count cars. In fact, nag-open si Nikki saying, oh, traffic na naman. 70% up traffic. Traffic is the movement of vehicles. So we count the flow of cars. We count how fast cars flow. Wala pa akong nakikitang headline na pedestrian movement up by 50%. Number of people waiting for jeeps down by 30%. Length of time of traveling from Metro Manila, from Monumento to Makati by bus increased by 30 minutes. Hindi natin binibilang yon. What we measure is traffic. And traffic is simply a measure of how many cars are passing through a particular road, right? So what we measure says what we value. It says what our values are, right? So the question we have to ask is, hindi ako magaling na artist, so sorry for my drawings. If vehicles travel faster, does that mean the system is better? Yun yung tanong, right? So during COVID-19, walang traffic. Kasi walang kotse. Kasi walang vehicles on the road. Does that mean that it was better? Better in terms of traffic flow, not necessarily better for the economy. Kasi walang tao sa labas. There was no economic activity. Diba? So what if the big question is, what if we're measuring the wrong thing, right? In terms of performance. What if instead of grades, ang mine-measure ng teachers nyo, or if you were a teacher, you're measuring students is, how many times does this student come in red clothes? A red shirt, or a red jacket, or red pants? Tapos yun yung grade mo for the semester. Labo, di ba? But what will you do? You'll wear red every day. Right? So if we say what's important, what we count is traffic and the movement of vehicles, that's what we work towards. Now imagine if you were training for a marathon. Right? Imagine you said, I'm going to train for a marathon, but ito lang yung feedback mechanism mo. They say you don't have a GPS, right? And you don't have a measurement device for distance. Wala ka ring timer. You have no idea how much time it takes for you to run. The only thing you have are Instagram likes from your pictures that you post. Right? Instagram likes lang. Would you be a successful marathon runner if that was the only thing you have for feedback? You might be a very well-dressed Instagram marathon runner, but we don't even know whether you'll finish the marathon course because the only feedback you're getting is the likes on Instagram. So if we're measuring the wrong thing, the system will fail. Here's another example, right? So you're getting a lot of examples from me. Let's say you are working for a company that produces fragile wine glasses. And your job is to load boxes. Pero sabi ng manager mo, I will pay you according to how many boxes you can load every day and how fast, right? So it's the speed of loading boxes is the only measurement. What do you think is going to happen, right? You're going to load a lot of boxes. You're going to break a lot of glass. So what we measure matters because it determines our performance. It determines what we say is important, and it determines our actions. Right? So measuring the wrong thing is not only bad in terms of the consequences. It also means we don't understand what the problem is. Right? So I'm going to bring up poll question number 2, which we sort of answered already when you changed your name. LA, can we bring up poll question number 2? So how many people travel in the same vehicle with you every day pre-COVID? If you take several vehicles, assume mo na lang yung largest, right? So is it 0, ikaw lang, 1 to 5, 12 to 24, 60 to 10, or 100 plus? Right? Choose one. Right? Pre-COVID too, how many people would travel with you when you were going to school or to work or wherever on a daily basis? Again, we'll give it 30 minutes. 30 seconds. 30 minutes pa lang haba na. That's my whole talk. Let's see. All right. 1 to 5. And then 8 of you, mostly 1 to 5, 14 of you. 8 of you are in 100 plus. I assume that's the train. 60 to 10. Sorry, that should be 60 to 80. Sorry, mali yung numbers ko. That should be 60 to 80. You'd be in a bus. 12 to 24, maybe you're in a Jeep or a set of Jeeps. And 0 is either you're walking, right? Or you're driving alone, right? So about more than half are in smaller vehicles, right? 19. And then way less than half, little over, 14, travel with larger vehicles. Why does this matter, right? And we'll go back to what we measure. I'm going to share some numbers with you. Here's some significant numbers. Only about 12 to 15% of households in Metro Manila own a car, right? Own a private vehicle. In fact, some of these households own 2 or 3 or more cars, but only 12 to 15%. So kukonti lang, 1 out of 10. But in terms of public transportation, 69 to 79%, depending kung ano yung survey na titingnan mo, use public transportation. Another number, private vehicles outnumber public utility vehicles 10 to 1. Do you guys see the disconnect in this? When we talk about traffic being the problem, and when we try to solve traffic, and we're only measuring the movement of vehicles, we're really only serving the 12 to 15% of people who use private cars. When we don't measure how many people are moving, right? When we measure how many vehicles are moving and not how many people are moving, then the car is just as important. A car with 1 person or a car with 5 persons is just as important as a bus that carries 80 people. That's not democratic. And it's not inclusive either. Which means that if you know how to drive and you can own a car, the system treats you with more importance. Some of the things we currently don't measure, right? How much on time on average people spend traveling? I'm sure you have your horror stories, especially people who live outside Metro Manila. If you're traveling from Cavite or Batangas, right? 2 or 3 hours. I remember when I was teaching in Saintsco, I lived in Fairview. To get to Saintsco, Manila, which is your neighbor, I would have to leave the house at least 2 hours before if I was going to get to school 30 to 15 minutes before school started. That was in the 1990s. Hindi ko na sabihin kung kailan in the 1990s kasi mapapahiya si Nikki. But it was that bad then. It's gotten worse now. The funny thing is there's lots of people telling stories, right? Even before COVID-19, do you remember how bad transportation was, the long lines and everything else? And people traveling, leaving at 4 in the morning to try to get to their office by 9 o'clock. We don't actually measure that. There's a lot of stories about it and news articles. We don't measure it. We don't record it. Another thing we don't record, right? We don't measure the number of people waiting for jeeps and buses at each intersection. If you're a person who travels only by car, I'm sure you've heard other drivers complain about, ito bang mga naghihintay ng public transportation, walang disiplina. They stand in the middle of the road. They should just wait on the sidewalk. If you are someone who takes a jeep or a bus, you know why you walk onto the sidewalk. Kasi ang dami-daming naghihintay and you want to see what bus is coming. And you try to position to get into the bus or into the jeep. But we don't measure that. The government has no idea how many people in any intersection are waiting for a bus at any time of day or a jeep. We don't measure the number of sheltered jeepney and bus stops. We don't know how many sheltered bus stops are there across Metro Manila. We don't measure or count the number of safe places to sit, right, while waiting for a bus or a jeep. We don't measure how dark or light our streets are at night. We have no idea which ones are the dark streets and the light streets. We don't know how much how people who don't own cars, how much they spend on transportation every day or every week or every month or every year. How much does it take out of your pocket? Have you seen any numbers? No, ang news lang palagi is traffic, traffic, traffic. We don't know how many people in wheelchairs or they need assistive devices travel on public transportation. No one has a count. We don't count that. The amount of information available to people who are blind or are deaf, right? We don't know. Where do they get their information? How much information do we actually provide them? We don't measure that. We don't measure how much carbon and pollution is being emitted or generated by a transportation system. We have requirements for tailpipe emissions when you register so that you get your permit. Sometimes we can cheat through that. But we don't measure it every day. Maybe we have air quality indexes, but we don't know how much it generates. Because we don't measure these things, they don't get any attention. We don't change them. We don't improve them. All right, I've got one more poll question. I've got two more actually, but I'm going to come up with poll question number 3. Could we bring it up, LA? Yeah. So this one, multiple choice. Right? You can choose as many as you want. If you take public transportation, even if you don't take it regularly, but you've ever taken public transportation, have you seen or traveled with anyone who is a person who is a wheelchair user or needs a walker traveling by themselves in public transportation? Or a person who is deaf or hard of hearing traveling by themselves? Or a person who is blind or visually impaired traveling by themselves? Or a person who has a psychological or learning condition traveling by themselves? If you've seen any of this, pick one of those or pick as many as you've seen. Right? All right. So just as I predicted, person who is deaf or hard of hearing, usually they're able to manage because our system is very visual. Right? Person who is wheelchair user or needs a walker, about 14 of you have seen that. Person who is blind or visually impaired, 11. And a person who has psychological or learning condition traveling by themselves, about 12 of you. So by these numbers, at least yung sample natin, medyo okay, no? You've seen these people. Whether you see them daily or not is not another question. But I ask that because the system does not see that. It does not count it. Because the only thing we count, again, is cars and how many cars are traveling. Right, so because cars are the only thing we count, right? What happens is we give more road space to private vehicles versus public utility vehicles, right? Traffic yung problema eh. So, madaming kotse, we give them more vehicles, right? With more space, rather. We have no sidewalks, or we have terrible sidewalks, right? We have terrible, if ever existed, facilities for people taking public transportation. Ano mga waiting shed? Or even along EDSA, di ba, yung mga supposedly waiting shed na pagka wala kang payong basang-basa ka na kung umuulan, right? There's not even any covering, there's not even any lighting. We build facilities that don't work for the disabled. How few of our LRT1 stations actually have elevators that are working? MRT1 even, our MRT3 even worse. We don't count ramps. How many sidewalk ramps are around Benilde and in the Malate area? We don't know that, right? So we don't build them, we don't count them, so we don't build them. We don't pay attention to how much longer people have to walk to cross a street. How much time does it take them to cross the street? So ang problem, going back to this theme that I keep repeating is, there was a saying we used to say in high school as a joke, how do you face your problem when your problem is your face? Right? Supposedly patawa. But I think there's a deeper problem. How do you face your problem when you don't know what the problem is? We are trying to solve the wrong problem, and that's shown by the fact that we measure the wrong thing. Right? So going back to our Instagram marathoner, ang sinosolve lang niya is whether cute siya in the outfit that he or she or they are wearing to run the marathon. they're not actually trying to run the marathon. So we're trying to solve traffic. Traffic is not the problem. The problem is not how do we move more cars. The problem, based on the numbers, right, is the problem is transportation. How do we move more people? And we start with what do we count? When we solve the wrong problem, we come up with the wrong solutions, right? So we work to make traffic flow faster. This drawing I stole from Copenhagenize, right? And it shows you the relative ease of routes for various modes. So kung kotse ka, it's as diretso as you can, right? Straight line. If you're in a bus, daming tigil, madaming rota, stop, you have to transfer, or public transportation like jeep or bus. If you're in a bike, lots of dangerous places, although during COVID, I think it's great. Certain cities like Pasig and Manila have started building out protected bike lanes. If you are a pedestrian, ikaw ang pinakawawa, right? You have to walk 500 meters or 1,000 meters to get to a crossing. You have to climb up the Mount Kamuning, right? Going up over the MRT to be able to cross. That's hard already if you're able-bodied, right? Kung medyo matanda ka na, meron kang baston, or mas mahirap. Lalo na kung naka-wheelchair ka. Diba? Hindi ka na makakatawid. So we make it so much easier for the thing that we count and we value, and so much harder for what we don't see. Again, I stole this from Copenhagenize. Okay. So, I'm lost. Okay, yeah. When we solve the wrong problem, we come up with the wrong solutions. So you'll see it everywhere. We widen our roads and get rid of sidewalks. Kasi hindi importante yung pedestrian. Hindi natin nakikita. Overpasses and underpasses, diba? To make traffic flow faster. U-turn slots, right, rather than traffic lights. Pedestrian overpasses, like I mentioned. Big highways, which we invest a lot of money in. And large signs that say, bawal ang tao dito. Kasi para sa kotse lang. The problem is, it doesn't work, right? Because of some very hard rules, right? Transportation or traffic is a geometry problem, right? And I'll throw some jargon later called induced demand. Two reasons, geometry and induced demand. So a car is about 10 square meters in space and will take up that much space wherever it is, whether it's parked or it's traveling. It takes up 10 square meters of space. The faster a car is traveling, the more space it actually requires. And here's the thing, right? In order to move the same amount of people who travel in a jeepney yan, pangit lang yung drawing ko, you'll need about 5 cars to move 20 people. That's assuming puno lahat ng kotse. So you can imagine what this does to traffic if you need that long a line of cars just to move the same amount of people in a jeep. Even more so for a bus, you need 20 cars, to all of them full with 4 people each, to move the same amount of people as you could move in a bus. So why do we have traffic? Because we keep encouraging people to take cars, because that's what we value. If we could get more people to ride public transportation, and a lot of people already do, then we would have less traffic. But again, traffic is the wrong problem to solve. Let me tell you a bit more about induced demand, and this has been clear in transportation. If you try to solve traffic by building more roads or wider roads, you get more traffic, right? Because then more people will travel by cars. And this is what Enrique Peñalosa likes to say. I think it was Brent Toderian or Enrique Peñalosa. Sabi niya, if you build a city for cars, you get a city that doesn't work for anyone, not even for cars, because it gets crowded. There's the geometry. It's what Jarrett Walker calls the tyranny of geometry. You can't escape it. It takes up so much space. But if you build a city for people, it works for everyone, including people in cars. Right? If you build it so people can walk to where they need to go, it works better for everyone. So we need to think about our system. We need to build a system that puts people first by counting them first, right? We count people, not vehicles. We count people not just in vehicles, but people walking, people waiting, people crossing the street, and work to improve those. So the system has to put people first. And it's not just transportation too. We need to think about housing and work. We need to make sure that people can live near where they work or they study affordably, so that they don't have to take long trips. What happens is that cheaper housing to own is outside the city, and we don't provide rules for building cheaper, affordable housing close into the city. So people live far off, and that generates a lot of trips, right? So what happens now is only the rich, so where there's lots of commerce, only the rich can really afford to live near where they work. It's not a surprise why places like BGC and Makati are surrounded either by very rich neighborhoods or informal settlements. Only the very rich can afford to buy. If you work in Makati, you have two choices. You can either live cheaply by moving outside and traveling 2 or 3 hours to get to work, or you rent from somewhere nearby in very bad housing. Because we don't have policies that make sure there's a match between where do people live and where do people work, where do people study and where do they live, right? So we need to bring that into the system too. So I have one more question before I wrap up, and then we will have a little discussion. LA, let's bring up that last question. Okay. Choose one, right? So put yourself in someone's shoes. If you're not, if you already are, then that's good. If you are physically disabled, getting around Metro Manila is easy, not easy but manageable, hard, impossible, dangerous. Now let's give it about 30 seconds. LA, I'll depend on you to put it up when you think everyone has answered. All right, here's the answer. If you are physically disabled, getting around Metro Manila is, everyone, 14 of you say hard. A number of you, 6 to 8, so another 14 say it's impossible or dangerous. And only one person says it's easy, right? Or not easy, but manageable. Very interesting. All right. So how do we change the system? Let's close out that poll. Yes, we need to change what we count. Right? Of course, when you start, again, your feedback mechanism. But we also need to change the values of the system. The transportation system, in fact, any system, is guided by a set of values, whether spoken or unspoken, right? So not counting cars says that what we value are cars and the people who travel by cars. Not counting people walking, people on bikes, people in scooters, people in wheelchairs means we don't value those people. Designing our systems so that it works only for people who are able-bodied, right? Or you're hindi naman athletic, but you can get around, right? In your 20s and 30s means that we don't value children and the elderly, right? Because it's harder for them to get around. We don't think about where people live and work and study and how that shapes our transportation system. So in any transportation system, as you design it and think about it, Move as One Coalition and Out Mobility had what they call the Lola or Lolo test. And you imagine, okay, kung ako ay lolo at lola, matanda na at ugod-ugod at may baston, how does this work for me? Madali ba? Mahirap ba? Kung medyo malabo na yung mata ko at hard of hearing ako, madali ba to o mahirap? Once we start checking our values and building our systems for the people who have the hardest time, the system works better for everyone. So, some more jargon. As an example, right? If we want less traffic, we should make it more costly to use a private car. That the only proven way to reduce traffic is what's called congestion pricing. And there are many variants, but the earliest variants in Singapore, if you've ever been to Singapore, is my area of the city that during peak hours, during work hours, right, you have to pay money to enter that part of the city. Right? It's congestion pricing. London does that. Stockholm does it too. And what that does is it reduces demand because you only go in if you really need to go and it's worth going, right? Since most people travel by public transportation anyway, the poor and middle class are protected. It's the people who can afford cars who have to pay. You see the same thing in expressways and tollways, right? People who own car have to pay more. Pero pag nasa bus ka, hindi ka pwede on the highway unless it's a provincial bus. So congestion pricing is one thing we need to do. We should make it more costly to park a car. In Tokyo and the cities of Japan, bawal bumili ng kotse unless you can show that you have a parking space. Bawal magpark on the streets at night. Right? And so these cities, in Singapore also, it's actually more costly to get the permit to buy the car than the car itself. Right? And what that does is it gives them money to put into their public transportation system. So you've got the examples of Tokyo, Singapore, and London on congestion pricing, and Tokyo and Singapore on pricing cars and pricing parking more expensively, right? So here's my last poll, and then we'll close with a few more points. Okay, multiple choice, so you can choose, right? Let me explain. What values should guide our transportation system, right? Should it be guided by equity? It means that it works for everyone, regardless of their economic class or physical or mental abilities. Should it be guided by social justice, that transportation should help reduce poverty? Should it be guided by empathy and considers how people experience the system? Should it be guided by a commitment to dignity? So it respects people who use public transportation and also works for people who work in public transportation. Should it be sustainable, guided by the values of sustainability and green, or it's good for the planet and fights climate change? Or it should be guided by efficiency. It uses less resources and does not waste time, money, or energy. So choose as many as you want, and let's see what the results are. All right. Okay, ang winner is sustainable and green, empathy, efficiency, constant improvement. So all of these are really, really good values: social justice and equity. And that's where we start. You don't start from what you measure. You start first with what are the values that should guide this system. And therefore, then you realize what is it that we measure. By changing the values, we can then ask, what is the measurement of that value? Okay, so the question we ask is, what are the values that guide your system? What are the values that guide our transportation system? Only when we decide what is valuable can we then decide what is it that we measure. Can we then have the right feedback that says we are actually achieving our values? Now, caution, not everything that can be measured matters. More importantly, some things that really matter cannot be measured. Like it's hard to measure how much better our family life is if we didn't spend 4 hours of the day in traffic or in waiting for transportation. So, wrapping back, right? We have our transportation system is not inclusive because we count the wrong things, and we don't count things that matter. And largely, all of that is in a value system that we don't question. I don't think anyone ever talks about it in DOTR. What are the values of our transportation system? And we need to talk about that. So every time you walk out, you drive your own actions, right? And then the investments that someday you will, as a leader of the country, will say, what is this company going to invest in? Or what is our country going to invest in? You have to ask, what are the values that are guiding our investments and our policies and our rules and our regulations? And that's the only way, when we're very clear about our values, will we get to a system that is inclusive. But I have hope. Right? I'll close on this, right? Cities are 80 to 100-year projects, right? So New York City, Manhattan was a terrible, terrible place in the 1910s and the 1920s. But over 80 years, it improved to be one of the livable cities in the world. Same thing with London. London was so bad in the 1800s that people were dying of cholera, 10,000 people a week. And the Thames the main river was so polluted, it was more polluted than the Pasig, that there were times it would set on fire. Right? So, but if we start working now in 20, 30, 40, maybe 80 years in our lifetime, we can see the city improve. So that gives me hope. I'll end here and let's have a conversation. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Ano, yung share mo ano what you were saying about having to move people. So ako, the reason why I use a car is because I have all 3 kids with me. I bring them to school
Good.
before I go to work. And I would actually prefer to take the public transportation, mass transit, because then it would give me time to read a book, to have conversations with the kids instead of
Mm.
focusing on driving,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the mass transit here in the Philippines is not very friendly. Sabi mo, lolo, lola. For
Mm.
mothers with
Oh,
small
absolutely.
children and a
Yes, and
diaper bag
strollers.
and, di ba,
Mm-hmm.
and strollers. So
Yeah.
it's actually not just for persons with disabilities or
Yes.
for the elderly, for senior citizens, di ba? It's even for, or kahit man lang, let's say, a student
May
with
dala kang groceries.
hours with dala kang groceries, hindi, definitely
Oh, yeah.
out na yon. And during
Oh.
the times that we don't have access to our own private cars, we end up using or booking a Grab.
Yeah.
A Grab car. Ganun na lang.
Taxi.
Kasi that's what's, taxi.
Right.
That's the easiest
Yeah. Right.
way to do things, di ba? And so, sabi you were talking about congestion pricing and all the other things that we could do to improve how transportation is in Manila. But how do you think we can affect change at this time? Kasi kung lahat ng sinabi mo na we make it more expensive for the cars, we require parking, we make it more expensive to get a license to drive a car. Pag ginawa mo yan, ang daming aalma. So there's gonna be some friction
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
if we do it at this time. So
Right.
what can we do?
Well, changing a system is never frictionless. Di ba? So there's always going to be a challenge. So the first thing we need to do is to change our own viewpoints. And I didn't mean to condemn people who travel by car, right? You do that because you're a rational being. It's the most convenient thing to do. And if you own a car, that's great. But you have to understand the privilege you have. Right? And you have to understand that when we start talking about the problem to solve, your problem is not the problem of 80% of the population. Right? So first we change our viewpoint and we work and talk about it that way. You have to understand, whenever you catch yourself saying, ano ba tong traffic na to? Realize that you are speaking from privilege. Right? So first we change our viewpoint. Second, we talk differently. And then we bring these issues to the people who matter and also to our friends to understand this. Now, Enrique Peñalosa, who's again one of my favorite mayors of Bogota City, said that a rich country or a rich city is not where the poor can drive around in cars. It's where the rich take public transportation. And that's where we'll succeed when we make public transportation so easy and dependable that you will say, why would I take a car? Like you're saying, I will have to drive and pay attention. It'll take me longer. I'll just take public transportation. And I don't mean a Grab. I mean taking the train or the bus, right? But we have to shift the system to that. As long as what we're always talking about is traffic, right? Then that's the wrong problem to solve. We won't be. We've been trying to solve traffic congestion for 50 years. It's not working and it will not work.
Ano
So the
tong
first thing we have,
Sorry. Pilipinas o
the
Seattle?
Filipinas, the Philippines. Oh, and the Philippines is not unique in that. We've followed other cities this way, right? Because we grew up in the time that we changed our cities and we said cars were the most important thing. And now we're learning that they're not. They're not efficient. And in the face of climate change, not very good for the planet. Even if everyone had an electric car, what you would have would be green traffic. It would still be traffic because of the tyranny of geometry.
Sige, thank you for that. Thanks. All that, parang hindi ko alam kung hope mas may pag-asa naman, di ba? Sabi mo, it takes like 80 to 100 years. So if we've been battling this for 50, we have about 30 to 50 more.
No, we start from zero. And we start from changing the way people... We start now. right?
Now.
And say, okay,
All
in
right.
what can we do in 10 years, in 20 years? And we start by saying, okay, yung sidewalk in front of our schools and our offices, anong itsura nun? Saan natin nilalagay yung parking? Right?
Uh-huh.
Yung crossings natin. Ano bang kailangan gawin dyan? Pagka nag-iisip ang gobyerno ng ano bang solusyon dito, or whenever you're in a meeting complaining about what's happening in your neighborhood or your school, if someone says parking ang problema, kumontra kayo. Hindi parking ang problema.
All right. So we have a few more questions here. We'll ask
Sure.
our participants to ask them directly to you. Abby, hello. Can we ask you to open your video if you're okay with that and ask your question?
I think Abby is not here anymore.
Oh, so sayang. Okay, but I'll ask her question later. How about si Diamond? Are you there, Diamond? Oh, I think we have before si Diamond, I think we have a deaf participant who would like to ask a question. Can you see him? He is Jeep Walk LRT Mond. You see? Yan. So somebody will be
Hello.
interpreting.
Yes. Hello. All right. So I'll ask my question now. I'll be signing. Okay. All right. So right now, I'd like to tell you that you had a very good presentation regarding jeepneys, jeepney drivers. Right now, it's so hard and not accessible to ride the jeep. For deaf people, it's quite hard to alight from the jeepney. For example, in Cubao, it's difficult because sometimes when the streets are too loud, when I knock or make a signal for the jeep to stop, they wouldn't hear me. Or if a lot of people are honking their horns, it's quite difficult. And deaf people are not very comfortable to use their voice. So I hope that we can think of a solution to make that more accessible, especially in congested areas like Cubao.
I totally agree, right? You have to say para, right? And I've seen jeepneys from when I was young, right? What they have are pull string to stop. Meron silang little bell, and that helps. There were old love buses before, push button to stop. So my audio for that. The other thing though that's more basic is that our jeepneys don't have stops, right? So they don't stop in usual places. They stop everywhere and anywhere. Why is that? Because we've built up a public transportation system where the earnings of the jeepney driver is based on how many passengers he gets. Right? This is the boundary system, which means bababad siya where he needs to get passengers. He will drive very fast and then pick up any passenger along the way. And usually getting off perwisyo yun because he's trying to get to the next place where he can pick up passengers. If we change that model, and instead, and this is what we're trying to do with the Move as One coalition, get into service contracting where the government pays the driver or the operator to run their jeeps based on kilometers, based on quality of service, then we can have regulated jeepney stops, and they will only stop there. They will drive safer. What we need to break, right? And again, part of the system is hindi napapansin ng people who drive in cars or the elite dahil they don't suffer it every day. Part of the problem is we've allowed fares to be equal to income. There are only 3 places in the world where transportation makes money. That's in the cities of Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. They make money not from the fares, but from real estate. So Japanese rail operators are property developers. And the property, the income of the property, commercial income, rent, and everything else, pays for the transportation system. It's the same thing in Hong Kong MTR. MTR is actually a real estate developer. In any other place, at best, yung fares that we get from the income that comes from fares pays about 30% of operations. So what we need to do is to change that model so that we, as a whole community, as national or metropolitan, pay through taxes to pay for public transportation. That doesn't mean that public transportation becomes free. That means it becomes sustainable. You still have to pay a fare, but it won't be the only income for the transportation operators. That means that they will be much more sustainable and they can replace their jeepneys when they need to. That means we can ask them to buy jeepneys that accommodate people in wheelchairs. That means we can ask them to buy better jeeps that have audio, all right, signaling systems. But as it is now, we treat it like namamalengke lahat yan. They're all individual entrepreneurs. Because what is the only thing we count? Cars.
So are you
Alright.
okay with that, Raymond? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
So we have another question from a student. I think Diamond is here na. Diamond, would you like to, asan na siya? Yan.
Hello.
Car LRT.
Yes.
I hope you don't take your car into the LRT.
Hindi po. Alternative po. So my question is, although the news shows the amount of traffic in major roads and sometimes the number of commuters utilizing public transportation, why do you think the current system still only counts cars? Similarly, since we only count cars, do solutions such as color coding actually work?
Those very good questions, Simon. I'll start with the last part of your question. Does color coding work? The technical term for color coding is demand management, and it's particularly vehicle reduction demand management. And what they do is, right, certain numbers of cars are not allowed on particular days, and other countries have tried this. What happens is, because people who own cars can afford cars, and they cannot drive their particular car because of the plate one particular day. What do? They buy another car. So what that does is you're actually increasing the number of cars and increasing congestion. So again, that's what happens. So color coding doesn't work in the long run. It has immediate solutions. But again, you're trying to solve only traffic. You're not improving how people are getting around by public transportation. Remind me, Diamond, the first part of your question.
The first part of my question po is why does the current system still only count cars?
That's a very good question. Part of it is in the laws we write, right? We say it's the Department of Transportation. What would it be if instead of the Department of Transportation, we had the Department of Public Mobility? What would that be if the name was different or the charge was different? Part of it is what we write in the laws and what we say is important. Part of it also is who are the loudest voices in society and what do they say is important. So if the news is saying traffic is the problem, it's because they're only talking to people who drive cars and who experience cars. Also, a lot of our leaders, and I'm not just talking about government leaders, I'm talking about our business leaders, our NGO leaders, our education and media leaders, they all travel by cars. In fact, if you work for a company, right, a big company in the Philippines, and you become a manager, what's one of your first benefits? A car loan. Right? And then if you become an executive, you have a company car. So all of our elite travel by cars, and they think that's the problem to solve, and we need to shift that. How we shift it successfully, I don't have a silver bullet, but it starts with us thinking differently.
Thank you po.
Thank you, Diamond.
Thanks, Diamond. Naisip ko, do you remember during, I don't know if it was the campaign period, kasi you were saying how the leaders of government take cars. Yung nagkaroon sila ng, sasakay ako ng, I'll commute to work.
Yeah,
I'll
the LRT challenge.
mag-aangkas.
Yeah.
O parang gano'n, no? Nagkaroon ng,
Tapos may isang sumakay ng LRT pero off hours, may kasamang mga bodyguard.
Correct. Oo nga.
Nagturista. There are places like in Chicago, at least under Mayor Ram Emanuel, ang requirement niya once a week, if you work for the city, you have to use public transportation to get to work and your meetings.
Right.
Imagine what that would be if all of our public officials, at least once a week or at least once a month, were required to take public transportation.
All right. Okay. Although Abby isn't here anymore, she had a very interesting question. Her question is, because you were talking about measuring what really
Yeah.
mattered, right?
Yep.
So her question is, how might we measure quality of life, such as happiness, time for
Mm.
quiet reading, or creative
Mhm.
endeavor?
Mhm.
So how do you measure stuff like that?
One easily is surveys, right? We should have annual
Mhm.
surveys or semi-annual surveys asking people traveling by public transportation, are you happy? Are you tired? What happens when you get home? What is the quality of your life, right? How much time do you spend? How far do you have to live from where you work in order to afford to own or rent a house, right? And a good house. So there are those kinds of surveys. The other, if you could get really medical about it, would be we could imagine that we would be testing for stress, right? Medical cortisol levels in people when they travel. So you could do that. So there are many ways. So to answer Abby's question, there are many ways. The question to ask is to first say, why aren't we doing it, and what will it take for us to do it?
May sagot ka doon?
Values.
Right. Okay. There's another question from Jillian Tan. Is sustainable mobility inclusive and possible here in the Philippines?
Yes. Yun lang ang sagot ko. It's possible.
It's possible. What's it going to take?
It's going to take a lot of us changing the way we talk about transportation, changing what we think is important, stop complaining about the wrong things, understanding our privilege, understanding why people behave the way they behave, and then voting for the right things and making that an electoral issue or talking to leaders about it. It means when we get into positions of power, we make choices and say, right, how much bicycle parking is there in Benilde now?
Yeah. Marami.
How much?
Marami.
Good. Then how many parking spaces? So when Benilde decides or Lasal decides, we're going to build a parking building, we must say, no, there's climate change. Maybe we should not. Okay? Or don't build it until you make sure that... I remember visiting your building and the first 3 floors were supposed to be parking, right? Right.
Yeah.
But at least hindi na. So that's good.
Oo nga. All right. There's a question from Jemai, but I don't think he wants to ask it himself, so I'll read it. So without being nostalgic or emotional with the concern of jeepney drivers, okay? So without considering the jobs of those who will be affected, should we do away with jeepneys and focus on mass transportation that can accommodate more people, such as trains and buses?
No. Because you can build as many trains as you want. One, they're very expensive. But 2, they will not reach everywhere. We have a very big city of 15 million, 22 million, depending on where you draw the boundaries, right? And there are lots of areas that are hard to get to that you wouldn't be able to bring a train to. You still need that connector that goes from the train station or the LRT or the subway station to the up the hills or in narrow places that you would need small vehicles to do.
Yeah.
So there are 2 things, right? Yes, we need to improve jeepneys, but there is a reason why that small form factor emerged, why it evolved, right? These transportation systems evolved. It's because it fulfills a need. And we can't imagine that just because we built out mass transit, this will go away. This is a mistake that lots of cities make. In Delhi, they built out a subway system in under time and on budget. And the chief minister at that time, this was in the year 2010, said, all right, now we've a mass metro system, we can get rid of the auto rickshaws. Auto rickshaws are the 3-wheelers, they're like tricycles. The problem was 80% of the city used auto rickshaws and 50% of the city couldn't afford the metro ticket. Even in places that have mature mass transportation like Mexico City, where they have extensive subways, they have bus rapid transit, 74% of public transportation trips are still taken through minibuses. Right? Or even so people like love trains, particularly people in cars, and they love subways because they imagine that it will free up the roads and so we can drive to our content. Even in most cities that have very extensive train systems, like say London, the bus system moves 5 times more people than the train systems.
Okay.
So
Wow.
yes, no, we cannot get rid of the form factor. You may decide we're going to change it and have newer vehicles. What I wouldn't want to lose is the cultural aspects of the jeepney. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but these are expressions of local art. Having an orderly transportation system doesn't have anything to do with them having the same color, same boring color. It has something to do with the way they operate.
Right. Sabi, Nolly said in the chat, the tricycles and the jeepneys, they serve the last mile when, All right. We have a question from, nawala ang Hold on. We have a question from one of our students, our Best Buddies Benilde students, Carlos Kanahashi. Carlos, would you like to ask Sir Benjie your question? You want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Hi, Carlos. Do you want to ask the question, Carlos?
Sure.
Okay.
Hello, good morning, Sir Benjie. I am Carlos Kanahashi, member of Best Buddies, Benilde, and Hanseling Ocean Philippines, and currently taking up real estate management in Benilde, Manila. And I have a question to ask. Before the coronavirus pandemic, what is the condition of the transportation system in the Philippines?
Thank you so much, Carlos, for your question. It was bad. Right? It was already bad. What happened in the COVID crisis was we banned all of the vehicles. So it got good in terms of not there being any vehicles, but that means no one was traveling. Right? And what the COVID-19 gives us a chance to do is to rethink the way we run transportation. And so the movement I'm part of, the Move as One coalition, is asking the government, and the LTFRB has already announced, they will do service contracting. And what it is they will pay the jeepney drivers to operate routes and the buses to operate routes, and then base the payments on their performance on time, safety, and all of that. And that will change the behavior of the system, or at least we'll see how that changes the system. So COVID-19, I hate to say it, in many ways is an opportunity to rethink our transportation system. The worst thing we can do is go back to the way things were, because they were very, very bad. The other good thing that's happening is we've started building out protected bike lanes and seeing how important bikes are for people to get around, particularly for our frontliners.
Right.
Medical frontliners.
In connection with that, we have another question from one of our participants, since you mentioned the bike lane. Si Alex. Alex?
Hello po. Good morning and good evening po, Sir Benjie.
Hi, Alex.
Yes po. So, yes, sir. With the recent hype in cycling here in the Philippines because of the pandemic, do you think this will continue afterwards, after the pandemic, or will this be temporary because our cities are currently designed for cars? So, what's your take on this, sir?
I hope it continues, because now you have a lot of people who have tried it, and a lot of people who have tried it when you have, even if it's a pop-up, temporary protected bike lane, it works. People can get to where they need to go. What we need to do is build it out across the whole metropolitan area so that you are safe. And so things are good when you see Makati build permanent protected bike lanes. That means that business sector is saying this is important. Things are good when you have the mall saying, oh, we need to provide more bike parking. I hope that we will not put the genie back in the bottle, that we will see that biking is a valid form of transportation and more people can take it. The other really interesting thing, of course, is electric bikes or electric kick scooters. So that if you're not so strong biker, you can still get around. Right? for cheap.
Mm.
And so a protected bike lane doesn't care whether you are on an electric bike or electric kick scooters, unless we build rules against it. You should still be able to get to where you go. Metro Manila is actually ideal. We're a very flat city. And all we need to do, as you said, is build, our transportation system is designed for cars. It's easy to convert them for bikes. All you need to do is claim back a lane.
Yeah. Pero parang napakahirap ng claim back a lane na yon.
Yeah, because everyone says traffic is the problem.
Right, right.
Isa
There's-
pang problema niyan, sabihin nila, it's a bike lane, walang dumadaan. Oo, kasi hindi nagkaka-traffic ng bike. Maliit lang ang bike eh.
Tapos ang ginawa nila dun sa lanes in some of the cities, like in BGC for example, they put traffic cones mulang to say that this is the bike lane. But apparently recently they've noticed that the traffic cones have been removed. So wala na ulit bike lane.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done and it has to come from the top, right? From leaders saying, no, this is
Right.
important. Kasi makakita ka rin ng mga police na tatanggalin namin tong lane na to, even if it was the DOTR or the DPWH that installed it. Right? So we need to go back and say, no, these are protected lanes. And it's very
Protected
important to
lanes.
have them. Protected, connected bike lanes. Again, going back to values, right? The best
Right.
bike infrastructure is bike infrastructure that works for anyone who is 8 years old or 80 years old. So if you go to the best biking cities in the world, like Copenhagen, like Amsterdam, old people are on bikes. Children are on bikes.
On bikes.
Their leaders are on bikes. And it only works if you... in fact, in research, doesn't matter if people wear helmets or not. You can actually not require helmets as long as you have safe infrastructure.
Wow. Sige. In connection with that, there's another participant who would like to ask a question. Si Ramon. Is Ramon here? And then
Yes,
after
sir.
Ramon, I have a question also.
Good
Hi,
morning,
Ramon.
slash Evening.
Good morning.
Let's say that the whole public transportation was fixed and it's good to use and it's really effective, but there are some people still taking private transportation. Their mind isn't changed about it. How and what are ways that you can convince them to take public transportation and that it would be much more effective for traffic?
We don't have to convince people to not own cars if they want to own cars. We don't have to convince them to not buy cars if they want to buy cars. What we have to do is make it harder for them to use the car every day. Right? So if you go again to cities that have encouraged biking, car ownership is still high, except they use it to go out for vacations to drive out. They don't use it every day. What we need to show, the only way to convince them to use their car less is to have really efficient public transportation. Now, if you are rich and you own a car, you're in Singapore, you own a Porsche, and you can afford it, then go ahead, drive all you want. You will pay the actual cost of owning the car and driving the car. That's fine. What we don't want is everyone saying public transportation is so bad, the next thing I'm going to try to do is own my own car. Right? So we just need to reduce the number of people using cars every day. And remember, it's only 10 to 12%, 12 to 15% of households. If you cut that by half, right, to say 6 or 8, usage, you're not even talking about ownership, usage, you already have traffic, right? And then if you make public transportation a priority so that it's easier for me to get to where I need to get by public transportation, why would I use the car? Only if I really want to. Kung gusto ko lang Japorms ako, whatever.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right. Thank you, Ramon, for the question.
Thanks,
So,
Ramon.
in connection kanina sabi mo we should start with leaders, 'di ba? About how we do things. Do you think the public transportation should be handled by government or should we privatize it?
Depends on what you mean, right? You cannot manage at a citywide level without having a body that is responsible to the people who live there, who is accountable. And for our democratic systems, that's government. If you have a system that is privately owned and initiated and its reason is to earn money, then you run into problems. So as an example, right, Facebook, its job is to earn money. And so it doesn't care if there's bad information going around as long as people are using it. Right? Now, with a lot of pressure from citizens and from governments, they're starting to change that. So what we need is for the system to have the values that serve the most people. How it's actually managed directly can be in many ways. It could be that you create a public-private corporation to manage the system. It could be that you would have privately provided. I'm not saying that government should own the transportation system. It just needs to manage it. Transport for London is a government agency. It's a metro-wide agency. And they run the transportation system, but they don't own the whole transportation system. They franchise the buses, they own the trains, then they franchise a lot of services. So there's many ways of where private sector can play. What you need to do is to align the system so that it serves the interest of the majority. And government's the best way to do that. Of course, with transparency and accountability. yun yung key.
Okay. Kids, don't forget to register and vote in 2022.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Very important. Do you think there are other modes of transportation that we can consider in Metro Manila? Kasi a couple of years ago, the Transportation Secretary, according to Gemma, hinted that they are willing to look into different modes of transportation, such as cable cars.
Yes, we can. We need to use water transportation, for instance, right? So that it's easier to cross. But it all depends, right? These particular modes that are fixed, like cable cars, the question first you have to ask is, what's there now? Can we improve what's there before we build something that's expensive? I'm always looking at those systems saying, who's providing it and who's proposing it and what do they think they're trying to solve? And mostly, like EDSA MRT was built where we had the most traffic and we thought it would solve traffic. Of course it doesn't. Public transportation shouldn't be designed to solve traffic.
Right.
It should be designed to move people. And if you were going to move people going from Quezon City to Makati, you didn't need to run it through this circumferential road. So fine, we can consider other modes. But more important than that, again, in my whole talk is let's decide first what is the system supposed to do. Then we can decide the things we will use, right? First decide what the job is, then you choose the tools. You're in trouble when you're choosing tools first if you don't understand what the job is.
Yeah. Carlo Dizon, are you here? I think your question is connected to what Benjie was talking about. Would you like to ask it? Carlo, si Carlo.
Yes, hi Sir Benjie, good morning po. Yes, so
good morning.
So my question is why our country, the Philippines, is why are we like last country that to have our own railway system, unlike our ASEAN member ASEAN neighboring countries like Vietnam and Singapore and everything. So why do you think is our country late in this?
I don't think you should focus on the mode itself, right? So Singapore has a subway. I don't think Ho Chi Minh City has a subway. I don't think most of the cities in Vietnam actually have subways. Thailand doesn't have or has very short ones. What we have to pay attention to is what is the transportation system intending to do. Then you choose the right mode, right? Jakarta has improved transportation a lot by building out bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit is building bus systems that behave like trains. So they have their own. So what happened in EDSA busway now, I hate that they call it carousel dahil parang pamperya and it's not transportation, is you have a dedicated lane so buses travel faster. And that's what Transjakarta has, is now the longest bus rapid transit by kilometers, longest bus rapid transit system around the world. They developed it over 10 years and it's improving the movement across Jakarta for people who use public transportation. Jakarta still is one of the worst traffic places in the world. But if you're not in a car, you actually get to move faster and better. So going back to your question, why are we last? Because we were trying to solve the wrong problem for the last 50 years. Right? And we didn't stop and say, teka, it's the wrong problem. Let's solve transportation, then we would have made the right investments in transportation. And it shows itself in big and small ways, right? And so I talked about MRT being put to solve traffic, and it doesn't. It also includes where do we put stations, right? And in MRT, we put stations between shopping malls, so we could build a shopping mall in between, and not where people were getting on and off. If you look at the Santolan station, right, in front of Camp Crame, it's 1,000 meters away from the intersection of where you want to get your jeep. Bakit? Right? When if you were thinking about people getting off and on transportation, then it should be right where you're going to get the jeep. Or we build the facilities without providing places for jeeps or buses to stop so you can quickly get on and off. Kasi ang iniisip lang natin yung train, building the train without thinking about the whole system.
Okay. So that answers it, Carlo?
Thank you po.
Thanks,
Thank
Carlo.
you. Okay. We have an interesting question. She'll ask it herself. See, Juliana Treñas? Juliana Stephanie. She has a question. Yeah, there she is.
Hi, Juliana.
Hi, sir. I just wanted to ask because I was reminded of it from my friend Ramon's question. Because I used to live in the province, so I would take a private car most of the time, but I'd also take the bus. And you mentioned that unless we stop prioritizing private vehicles, and of course, we discourage it, through like different policies, then we can increase the use of public transport. But then most of the public transportation that we were discussing were improvement of systems within Metro Manila. But then in the province, bus stops are still kind of like empty lots. So tas malayo pa. So it's really difficult to get there. Like you'll have to take a tricycle for 35 minutes. And of course it's inconvenient, and it can also rack up expenses because you're taking a tricycle. So what would you suggest in terms of like improving the system overall, not just in Metro Manila, but then also like outside of it? And this is also taking into account the development of the different provinces in which the buses are in.
Right. First of all, the solutions we propose should work across, not just Metro Manila. There should be high-speed rail, right? So that you get from the rural areas to the city as fast as possible. Then the facilities around high-speed rail should be easy to walk to. There should be housing around the stations. There should be easy to walk within. The first solution is to be able to walk, right? If you're under a kilometer or a kilometer and a half, there's no reason why you should be able to walk. The reason we have lots of tricycles is we don't have sidewalks, so it's dangerous to walk. So we take small vehicles, right? So that's another thing, right? Build our cities and our towns so that it's easier for people to walk. Second is we'll change the way, again, we pay for public transportation. It shouldn't just be the fares. And one should change the business model. You can also start changing the way we regulate it. So you could imagine that it's not just tricycles. Maybe there is a circulator in your small town. So you can get off somewhere and it's easy to predict when the bus or the small bus or the mini bus will come. And the payment that you have for paying on the minibus is the same payment that is accepted on the on the high-speed rail or on the LRT. So it's a unified payment system, right? I'll check in here, check in there. This is not magic because other cities have done it, right? That if you go to Tokyo, your transport card will be accepted on the bus, will be accepted on the train, and you will be charged just for one trip. But we need to be able to do that. We need to rethink the way the system is structured and the way resources and cash flows in the system. So just to correct, right? What we want to do is not make it hard for cars, so therefore we will improve public transportation. What we do is we improve public transportation first and work hard on that. And then at the same time, the only way to solve traffic is to make it harder for cars. You really want to get rid of traffic, make it harder for cars. So going back to Jakarta, right? Public transportation is getting better. They still have traffic because they're not yet ready to make it harder for cars. And that's the art, right? When do you get to where it's really easy in public transportation now? And now in order to solve the environmental concerns of traffic, we then put constraints on traffic. And they're mutual. So in London, the congestion pricing that you pay to enter London at particular times or the downtown, the revenues, you use that to pay for public transportation.
Okay. There's one last question from a participant of ours, which I think you will find interesting kasi you get asked this question then in other forums. Paul, would you like to nakalagay lang car, jeep, train, walk, pero si Paul siya.
Okay. So, good morning, sir. My question is, since Metro Manila is very, what they call this, densely populated and suffered a lot of poor planning, especially given the typhoon where Marikina has suffered the most collateral damage due to rapid development in that watershed. I was thinking that, yeah, well, in relation to Duterte, speaking before about federalism, when federalism, its main mechanism is to disperse the power into different places. It should go the same with dispersing or decongesting Metro Manila. Wouldn't it be better since cars here in Metro Manila is seen as a superior commodity? It seems inevitable that things could be made harder for them because as time progresses, many people are still buying cars. And right now, given the pandemic, main thoroughfares like EDSA is still traffic. Why not instead create? Would it be viable? Would it be possible? Would it be viable to create micro cities or to develop provincial areas since they're the ones that need of more development, so as to have a feel of the metro there also because many people have seen Manila as a prime city. Doon talaga yung pakipagsapalaran ng mga tao eh. Yun ang mga tingin ng mga from the province eh. They view Metro Manila pa rin as a place for opportunity. Why not do it in their home place para hindi na sila mahirapan din? And given the fact that, well, in my own observation, Metro Manila is been diverse in terms of ethnicity. So when you see not all are pure Tagalog and all that stuff, and people on the other hand also suffered being displaced, especially those of informal settlers. Ayun.
So I always Nikki says, always get asked this question. Say, okay, well, first of all, the term decongestion is about either your breathing, congested breathing, right? It's medical. When you're decongesting, you have a cold, and what you take a decongestion is for it to flow. Or it's about transportation, when traffic is congested. We've mistaken that to mean the city itself is congested when what we mean is overcrowded. Here's the funny thing. There is actually no, and I always challenge people this, show me an example of a new city decongesting an established city. There is no example. There's lots of examples of countries saying, we're going to build a new city and that will draw away growth from other places, and it doesn't succeed. So Brazil built Brasilia because Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and Bahia de Salvador were very big cities, and they said, we need a new capital that will draw growth there. What happened in the 40 years after? Brasilia grew, but Sao Paulo went from 10 million to 22 million. Rio de Janeiro went from 8 million to 18 million. Right? So the big cities still tend to grow. And this is the way cities act. It's just par for development. So if you look at Paris, Paris contributes about 30% of the economy of France, 40% or something, and accounts for about the same size of population, 40 to 50% of the population. It's very dense city. Same with Tokyo. Tokyo, Greater Tokyo, which is the largest city in terms of population, 38 million. By itself, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. And not because Japan hasn't tried to, encourage development in other places. In fact, Japan spends a lot in rural areas. But it doesn't work. unless you say, you can't come here, we're going to put up walls, people go to where opportunity is, just as you said. And opportunity, economic opportunity, is generated by agglomeration economics, right? The more companies are around the place, the more jobs there are, the more opportunities to switch jobs. Even in the most basic psychology, right? If you are a farmer, very few farmers actually think, I want my children to be farmers too. I want my children to be a doctor or a lawyer and whatever. So they go to the near city, and then if they're more, the bigger jobs are in the big city. So what I'm saying is it's very, very hard, if not nearly impossible, to slow down the growth of a very big city. And imagine, even more so, that building another city or a set of smaller cities will draw growth away from that city. It just doesn't work. If someone can find an example for me in the last 100 or so years, I'll be very glad to pay good money. But that doesn't happen. What it does is it then keeps us from investing the right things in the big cities. Right? So another example, Islamabad. So in Pakistan, Pakistan said, we'll build a new city because Karachi is such a problem. So here's Islamabad. They built it. It's big, wide roads. What happened was a neighboring city, Rawalpindi, that's where all the very fast, uncontrolled growth happens, because that's where people could afford to live in order to work in Islamabad. At the same time, what happened to Karachi? It grew by another 10 million people. So rather than investing in the facilities and infrastructure that they needed for the city, it was a distraction. I'm not saying we shouldn't invest in our rural areas. We should, and create opportunity there. But don't imagine that doing that will slow down the growth or even reverse the growth of Metro Manila. In fact, the only time cities lose population is when there is an economic crisis and the economy is falling. Now, if you want to do that to Metro Manila, good luck. It is about 40% of our national economy. And that is par for the course. All the big city countries have big cities, and they carry a whole lot of the economy.
Thank you, sir.
So, thank you. Paul, happy birthday pala. Birthday mo daw.
Happy birthday, Paul.
So,
Yeah.
so that's our last question actually.
All right.
And I mentioned, I'd like you to tell this story kasi I mentioned kanina sa introduction when I was introducing Benjie that many, many years ago in another time and place, he was an high school English teacher. He was a high school English teacher at the high school where I went to. And now he works with transportation and urban planning. So, because I think we have a lot of students here, and it's always a good story to tell when how people reinvent themselves. Diba? Don't get stuck in a mold. So how did you move from English teacher to...
So I love teaching. And I was in my 20s. I loved teaching. And in fact, I met my wife, who was my co-teacher in the high school that I was teaching in. But after about the third year, I said, so my undergrad is journalism. And by my third year, alam ko na ayoko maging journalist. Right? But I wanted to do something else. And then I tried writing speeches for a politician. I tried working in a magazine. And then a friend of mine invited me and said, you're looking for teachers. I need a job. So I tried, and I walked into the school, and I really instantly liked it. I fell in love with the place. But by third year of teaching, I said, if I do this one more year, that's it. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I felt like I didn't know enough to actually be teaching. Right? I just knew my curriculum. I didn't know enough about life. So I went, and then I left. I didn't know what job I was going to go to. And I started looking for jobs. And through a friend, I got introduced and said, I'll introduce you to the HR guy in Ayala. And he gave me a letter. And I said, okay, I went there. They hired me to edit their policy manual, their HR policy manual. Okay. And I was editing it because I was curious. I kept looking at the policy and saying, okay, hindi lang yung language yung problema dito, mali yata yung policy. So I kept asking, why are we doing it this way? And I actually had good questions, I think, or I was makulit. So then they said, okay, now we're going to turn you into an HR consultant. So from an editorial consultant, I became an HR consultant. And then they put me in communications in this was the Ayala Group. And then I jumped from company to company, including running GNet when it was new, the internet service provider, and then being part of the takeover team for Manila Water. When I was in Manila Water, I got to see a lot of the city. And I started thinking about cities, and I was playing SimCity at the time. And I thought, oh, what are the problems of our city? Can we fix this? And I wanted to fix the problems of the city. But I didn't want to be, the word is dilettante, right? To be an expert without actually knowing anything. So I decided I was going to try to take a master's degree in urban planning. And I applied and got accepted in my dream school. And so I went. I was able to get a loan, but I'm still paying for. And then started working, got my urban planning degree. And a good mentor once said, don't fall in love with solutions, fall in love with the problem. And so I've fallen in love with the problem of cities and how they work. And from then on, right, had job after job that had something to do with cities, development, informality, transportation, and all of that. So that would be my advice, right? What is the problem that you want to solve in the world? Don't imagine that you're going to be the one to solve it, but you may be able to contribute something the way the solutions that are being generated. Maybe you'll be able to contribute.
Thank you. Parang ako yung kausap mo doon, no? Don't fall in love with the solution, but fall in love with the problem.
With the problem.
And
yes.
inclusion is a wonderful problem to fall in love with, actually.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to thank you. We'd all like to thank you, our different partners today, Best Buddies, Benilde, Hub of Innovation for Inclusion, CIE, the Center for Inclusive Education, and the PDGII, the Pedro de Garucha Innovation Institute. So thank you very much for joining us today. Would you like to say any last words for us? Actually, yung niisip ko na baka you could answer also. You said we've been asking the wrong questions. We need to, we have 50 years to do things. So who starts?
We start. So sign up for
Who's gonna
go on Facebook and look for Move as One Coalition. Sign up to volunteer. Read about transportation as much as you can. When you see the news and it says traffic is the problem, question it, right? Question things. Follow my newsletter. Sign up for makeshiftmobility.substack.com. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at Benjie DLP. Shoot me an email, a DM if you want to answer a particular question or whatever. But just be curious in the world, and like Nikki said, work towards inclusion. So whenever you see something that is working or not working, you ask, who is getting excluded and why, and what can we do to change that? Thank you. This has been really fun. I hope it was helpful and a learning experience for all of you.